Paris, November 10th, 1799. The coup was failing. Napoleon Bonaparte stood in the middle of a legislative chamber, surrounded by deputies who were screaming for his arrest. Men in robes were pushing toward him. Some grabbed at his uniform. The soldiers outside were watching and waiting, and had not yet decided what to do. The general who had humiliated the armies of Austria and redrawn the maps of Europe was being physically dragged out of that room by his own bodyguards. He was shaking. He could not speak. His brother saved him. A convenient lie saved him. And by nightfall, the French Republic had ceased to exist. That image matters more than any of his victories, because this is not a story about a great man who conquered Europe. It is a story about what happens when a revolution succeeds, discovers it cannot govern itself, and reaches for the one kind of man who can hold it together, and what it costs when it finds him. The French Revolution promised liberty. It promised equality. It promised that the old world of kings and inherited power was finished forever. Then it produced Napoleon. Napoleon ended the revolution. And when he was done, the ideas the revolution had announced were more durable, more legally embedded, more widely spread across the world than they had ever been before he took power. That is not a paradox with a clean resolution. That is the question this story is about. How do you save a revolution by ending it? And what does it mean that you had to? Chapter 1. The Outsider, Corsica, 1769. The island had been French for exactly 1 year. Not by choice, not by revolution or war or any decision made by the people who lived there. Genoa, the Italian republic that had owned Corsica for centuries. He had sold it to France in 1768, the way you sell a piece of furniture you no longer want. The Corsicans were not consulted. They were transferred, a year later, on August 15th, 1769. A boy was born in the coastal city of Ajaccio to a family of minor Corsican nobility. His name was Napoleon de Bonaparte, not Napoleon Bonaparte. That came later. That was the French version, the version he would eventually adopt when it became useful to sound like the country that owned his island, rather than the island that resisted that ownership. From the first day of his life, he was two things at once, and neither of them completely. His father Carlo was a lawyer and a minor nobleman who had fought alongside the Corsican independence leader Pasquale Paoli against the French takeover. When the French won, Carlo made a calculation. He submitted. He learned to work within the new system. He secured French recognition of his noble status, which was the only thing that mattered practically, because noble status meant his sons could be educated at French military schools at the crown's expense. It was a rational decision. It was also the first lesson his son would absorb without being taught it directly. Survival requires knowing which world is ending and which world is beginning, and it requires being willing to move before everyone else has accepted that the change is real. Napoleon arrived at the military school at Brienne in 1779. He was 9 years old. He spoke French with a heavy Corsican accent. He had no money beyond his scholarship. He had no connections among the French aristocratic families whose sons surrounded him. He was small. He was foreign. He was proud in a way that made the foreignness worse, because he did not attempt to hide it or apologize for it. The other boys made his life difficult. This is not a story about childhood hardship producing greatness. That explanation is too simple and too convenient. But there is something specific that happened at Brienne that is worth understanding. Napoleon did not respond to exclusion by seeking acceptance. He responded by building an interior world that did not require it. He read, obsessively and without guidance. History above everything. Plutarch. Ancient commanders. The mechanics of how power moved through societies and why some men bent history and others were broken by it. He was not reading for pleasure. He was reading the way a person reads when they are trying to understand a world that has not yet made space for them. He was also doing something else. He was watching, not with resentment, though the resentment was there, with attention. He was learning how French institutions worked, how French military thinking operated, where the assumptions were, where the gaps were, where a man with different instincts might move through systems that were not built for him. He graduated and received his commission as a second lieutenant in the French artillery in 1785. He was 16 years old. He ranked 42nd out of 58 in his class. Not a prodigy by conventional measures. What the rankings did not measure was this. He had spent 6 years inside a system that was not built for him, learning it from the inside, finding its pressure points, understanding that the rules governing everyone else had been written by people whose position those rules were designed to protect. And he had concluded, with the cold clarity of someone who has nothing to lose by the conclusion, that those rules were not natural laws, they were choices, made by people, for reasons, and choices made by people for reasons could be unmade by people with better reasons. He returned to Corsica after graduation. He tried briefly to involve himself in Corsican politics, to fight for the island's autonomy within the French system. He had not yet decided what he was. Then, 1789 happened. The French Revolution did not feel the same to everyone who lived through it. For the old aristocracy, it was catastrophe. For the urban poor of Paris, it was possibility. For the lawyers and intellectuals who had been reading Rousseau and Voltaire and dreaming of a different kind of society, it was the moment theory became real. For Napoleon Bonaparte, it was something more specific than any of those things. It was the elimination of the only barriers that had ever stood between him and everything he was capable of. The revolution abolished the system that required officers to prove noble lineage before receiving senior commands. It abolished the assumption that birth determined position. It announced, in principle and then in law, that talent and merit were the only legitimate basis for advancement. Napoleon had talent. He had known that for years. What he had not had was a world willing to recognize it. The revolution built that world, but Napoleon was not yet the man the revolution needed. In 1789 he was still figuring out what country he belonged to, still caught between Corsica and France, still trying to locate himself in a world that was changing faster than anyone could map. The moment that settled it came not from ideology or ambition but from violence. In 1793, Corsican politics collapsed into factional fighting. The independence leader Napoleon had once admired turned against the French Republic and against the Bonaparte family. The Bonapartes were forced to flee. Their house was ransacked. They escaped to the French mainland with almost nothing. Napoleon never went back. Corsica stopped being home the day it tried to destroy his family. France became home, not by choice, but by elimination. He was French now because he had nowhere else to be. And that is when things began to move very fast. Because a man with nowhere to retreat is a different kind of dangerous than a man with options. A man with nowhere to retreat does not calculate risk the way other men do. He does not weigh the cost of failure against the comfort of staying where he is. He moves forward because forward is the only direction that exists. Napoleon was 24 years old. He was a French artillery officer with a Corsican accent, and no family home, and no political connections, and no inherited position. He had one thing: he understood, with a precision that most men his age had not yet developed. Exactly what he was, and exactly what he was not. He was not charming in the way that opened drawing-room doors. He was not patient in the way that built careers through careful accumulation. He was not interested in the slow mathematics of peacetime advancement. He was fast. He was precise. He saw the geometry of situations, military and political, in a way that other men had to be trained to approximate and that he seemed to simply perceive, and he was in a country that had just destroyed its old leadership class, was being invaded on multiple fronts, and desperately needed people who could do what he could do. The revolution had not created Napoleon, but it had created the only conditions under which Napoleon could become what he was about to become. That distinction matters, because the story of the next 10 years is not the story of a great man imposing his will on history. It is the story of a man and a revolution that needed each other, finding each other at exactly the right moment, and what happened to both of them when they did. Chapter 2. What the Revolution Was. Paris, July 14th, 1789. The Bastille fell. That is the image history kept. The fortress, the mob, the gates coming down, the prisoners released, the governor's head carried through the streets on a pike. It is a powerful image. It is also incomplete, because what fell on July 14th was not just a building. What fell was an idea. The idea that the old order was permanent, that kings ruled because God had arranged the world that way, that the distance between a nobleman and a peasant was not a social choice but a natural fact, as fixed as the distance between the sun and the earth. That idea had been weakening for a century. Voltaire had attacked it with wit. Rousseau had attacked it with philosophy. The American Revolution had attacked it with muskets and won. But it took the Bastille to make the collapse feel real. The problem was, what came next? Destroying the old world turned out to be the easy part. The men who led the revolution in its first years were lawyers and philosophers and writers. They were brilliant at diagnosis. They could explain with precision everything wrong with the monarchy, everything corrupt about the aristocracy, everything unjust about a system that determined your entire life by the circumstances of your birth. What they were less brilliant at was construction, because destroying a system of power does not automatically produce a replacement. It produces a question. And the question the French Revolution asked, loudly and without a clear answer, was this: if not the king, then who? The first answer was the National Assembly, representatives of the people, debate and law, and the slow machinery of democratic governance. It almost worked. But France, in 1789, was not a clean political laboratory. It was a country with an empty treasury, a king who accepted constitutional limits with one hand and plotted against them with the other, an aristocracy that had fled to foreign courts and was actively recruiting European monarchs to invade and restore the old order, and a population in Paris that was hungry and angry and not inclined to wait for legislative procedures to address either problem. The revolution began eating, not metaphorically, the logic of revolution, once fully engaged, has an internal appetite that is very difficult to satisfy. Each threat, real or perceived, requires a response. Each response creates new enemies. Each new enemy justifies greater measures. The circle tightens. In 1792, France declared war on Austria. The war was supposed to be quick and clarifying. It was neither. In 1793, the king was executed. Louis XVI went to the guillotine in January. The moment the blade came down, every monarch in Europe understood that the French Revolution was not a local problem. It was a direct threat to the principle that made their own power legitimate. The coalition against France expanded. Prussia, Britain, Spain, the Netherlands, Austria, the most powerful military forces in Europe, aligned against a country that had just decapitated its own military leadership along with its king. France needed to defend itself. It also needed to feed itself. It also needed to decide who was sufficiently loyal to the revolution and who was secretly working against it. These three problems, military survival, economic collapse, and political paranoia, combined to produce the most terrifying episode in the revolution's history. The Terror. Maximilien Robespierre was not a monster by temperament. He was a lawyer from Arras, precise and idealistic, and genuinely committed to the principles he had helped articulate. He believed in liberty. He believed in equality. He believed that the revolution represented the highest expression of human possibility. He also believed that the revolution had enemies everywhere. Inside the government, inside the army, inside the committees that were supposed to be running the country. He was not entirely wrong about this. The Committee of Public Safety, which Robespierre dominated, responded to the crisis with a system of revolutionary tribunals and a pace of execution that France had never seen. Between September 1793 and July 1794, approximately 17,000 people were officially executed. The real number, counting those who died in prison or in mass killings in the provinces, was higher. The guillotine became the symbol of a revolution that had begun with the promise of human dignity. Here is what that means for understanding Napoleon. It would be easy, and wrong, to read the Terror as a betrayal of the revolution, as the moment when good principles were corrupted by bad men, but that reading lets the revolution off too easily. The Terror was not an accident. It was not a deviation. It was what happens when you try to rebuild an entire political order from scratch, under external military pressure, with no institutional inheritance to fall back on, among a population with wildly different ideas about what the new world should look like. The revolution announced principles that were genuinely radical: liberty, equality, popular sovereignty, the rights of man. It had no reliable mechanism for resolving disputes about what those principles meant in practice. When people disagree about fundamental values, and there is no agreed procedure for managing that disagreement, disagreement tends to resolve itself through force. Robespierre understood this. His solution was to eliminate the people who disagreed. It worked. In the short term, the way that solutions based on elimination usually work. Then, in July 1794, Robespierre was arrested by men who feared they would be next on his list. He was executed the following day. The machine that Robespierre had used to eliminate his enemies was used to eliminate Robespierre, and France looked around at what it had built and tried to figure out what came next. What came next was the Directory, 5 men, a bicameral legislature, a system designed to prevent any single person from accumulating too much power by distributing power so widely that it became almost impossible to use effectively. The Directory governed France from 1795 to 1799. It was corrupt. It was factionally divided. It lurched from crisis to crisis. Its economic policies failed. Its military policies succeeded often enough to keep France alive, but not enough to end the wars that were bleeding the country. The men who ran the Directory were not stupid. Several of them were genuinely talented. They were operating inside a system that had been designed to prevent the kind of concentrated authority that efficient governance actually requires. They were also operating in a country that was exhausted. This is the part that histories of Napoleon often skip past, and it is the part that explains almost everything. By 1799, France had been in a state of continuous political crisis for 10 years. 10 years of revolution, terror, reaction, and unstable governance. 10 years of war with the most powerful military coalition in European history. 10 years of economic disruption, currency collapse, and food shortages. The French people were not abandoning the revolution's ideals because they had become cynical. They were abandoning them because they were tired. There is a specific kind of political exhaustion that sets in after sustained crisis. It is not apathy. It is something more active than apathy. It is the moment when people stop asking whether a system is just and start asking whether it works. When the question shifts from what kind of government do we deserve to what kind of government will actually keep us alive, that shift is the most dangerous moment in any revolution. Because in that moment, the population becomes willing to accept things it would never have accepted at the beginning. Concentrations of power it would have called tyranny in 1789. Restrictions on political freedom it would have called betrayal in 1792. It becomes willing to accept those things because the alternative is not the glorious republic of the revolutionary pamphlets. The alternative is another year of this. And this, by 1799, was genuinely unbearable. Robespierre had tried to save the revolution by purifying it. The result was the terror and his own execution. The Directory had tried to save the revolution by institutionalizing it. The result was paralysis and a government that could not actually govern. Both approaches had failed. France was still a republic in name. The question of who came next was not really a question about ideology anymore. It was a question about capacity. Who could actually hold this together? The revolution had spent 10 years asking what the right principles were. It had run out of time to keep asking. It needed someone who could answer a different question. Not what should France be, but how do you make France function when the people who built it are gone? The institutions they built are broken, and the country is surrounded by enemies who would prefer it did not exist at all. That question had an answer. The answer was 30 years old. He had a Corsican accent and a mind that processed military and political situations with a speed that the men around him found unsettling. And he was about to walk into a legislative chamber and nearly get himself killed by a room full of lawyers. But he would survive that too. Chapter 3. The General, the Revolution, Made, Paris, October 5th, 1795. The Directory was not yet born. The Convention, the legislative body that had survived the terror, was attempting to implement a new constitution. A coalition of royalists and disaffected citizens, somewhere between 25,000 and 40,000 armed men, was marching on the Tuileries to overthrow it. The convention had one general available to defend it, Napoleon Bonaparte. He did not hesitate. He did not negotiate. He did not attempt the careful political maneuvering that the situation might have seemed to call for. He positioned his artillery on the streets leading to the Tuileries. When the crowd advanced, he ordered his gunners to fire. Not warning shots, not gestures, grape shot, fired directly into the advancing columns in the streets of Paris. The crowd broke. Several hundred people were killed or wounded. The royalist insurrection collapsed in less than an hour. The event is recorded in history as 13 Vendémiaire, named for the revolutionary calendar month in which it occurred. What it means for this story is something larger than a battle won. Napoleon had just saved the revolutionary government from its internal enemies by doing exactly what no revolutionary idealist was willing to do. He had used overwhelming, directed violence against French citizens to preserve French institutions, and in doing so, he revealed the logic that would define everything that followed. The revolution could announce its principles. It could not defend them without men willing to act in ways those principles made uncomfortable. It needed someone who would do what was necessary without flinching at the gap between what was necessary and what was right. Napoleon was that man. 13 Vendémiaire was not just a battle, it was a template. The first time the revolution reached for Napoleon to save itself by methods it could not officially endorse. It would not be the last. Now move to the siege of Toulon, 2 years earlier, and understand it in the same light. Toulon, December 1793. The city was in British hands. A royalist faction had opened the harbour to the British Navy in August. British and Spanish troops were now occupying France's most important Mediterranean port. The Republican army surrounding the city had been trying to take it back for 4 months and failing. The problem was the artillery. The British had positioned their guns on a peninsula called Les Guillettes that commanded the entire harbour. As long as they held that position, the Republican fleet could not enter. As long as the fleet could not enter, the city could not be retaken. A young captain named Napoleon Bonaparte arrived at the siege in September and looked at the problem. He looked at it the way he looked at everything. Not as a fixed situation to be managed, but as a geometry to be solved. Not what can we do given the constraints, but which constraint, if removed, changes everything else. He identified Les Guillettes immediately. His superiors were skeptical. His plan required repositioning the entire artillery complement, building new battery positions under fire, and concentrating force on a single point rather than maintaining pressure across the whole defensive line. He was 23 years old and held the rank of captain. They let him try anyway, partly because nothing else was working. When the Republican guns controlled Les Guillettes, the British position became untenable. By December 19th, the British had evacuated, and Toulon was back in Republican hands. Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general on the spot. He was 24 years old. But these two moments, Toulon and 13 Vendémiaire, are not simply evidence of a gifted soldier rising through the ranks. They are evidence of something more structural. Napoleon did not appear as a finished product. He appeared as the product of a specific system that the revolution had built, operating in conditions that the revolution had created, solving problems that the revolution's wars and instability had generated. Walk back through the chain. Before 1789, the French Artillery Corps was one of the few branches of the military where advancement, based on technical merit rather than noble birth, was at least partially possible. Napoleon had entered that corps specifically because it was one of the only doors open to a man of his background. He had spent years studying its technical literature with the obsessive precision of someone who understood that knowledge was the only capital he had access to. The revolution then did two things simultaneously. It removed the aristocratic officer class that had filled senior positions based on birth rather than capability, and it expanded the French army from a professional force of roughly 180,000 men to a mass citizen army of over 700,000 within 2 years. That expansion created an enormous vacuum of military leadership. The old system would have filled that vacuum with men whose grandfathers had served the king. The new system filled it with men who could actually do the job. But there was something more, something that goes beyond the opening of meritocratic doors. The revolution had also changed how French armies fought. The old European model of warfare was a careful, expensive, slow-moving business. Armies were composed of professional soldiers who had taken years to train and were very expensive to replace. You maneuvered. You threatened supply lines. You sought positional advantage. You fought pitched battles only when you were reasonably confident of winning. The revolution replaced that army with something different. Citizen soldiers. Men who were fighting for France, for the Republic, for the principles of 1789, not for a wage. Men who could march faster, who could live off the land rather than requiring the enormous supply trains that conventional armies depended on, who could accept higher casualties without breaking, because their motivation was not contractual. Napoleon saw exactly what this combination meant. You had armies that could move faster than any force in Europe, that could accept risks that no professional army could accept, that could be split and converged on a single point with a speed that the enemy, operating on conventional timelines, could not anticipate or counter. He had been waiting his entire life for exactly this combination. What followed was Italy in 1796. Napoleon was given command of the army of Italy. It was not a prestigious assignment. The soldiers were hungry. Some were barefoot. Morale was poor in the specific way that morale gets poor when men have been sitting in mountains for months without pay and without adequate food. Napoleon arrived and gave them a speech. Soldiers, you are hungry and poorly clothed. The government owes you much and can give you nothing. I am going to lead you into the most fertile plains in the world. There you will find honor, glory, and rich. It was a promise. It was also a description of a plan he had already worked out in enough detail to be confident making the promise. He moved fast, faster than anyone expected. He used the terrain to separate the Austrian and Piedmontese forces, preventing them from combining. He struck each separately before they could reinforce the other. 5 battles in 11 days. Piedmont sued for peace. Then he turned on the Austrians. The Austrian commanders he faced were experienced officers who had spent decades studying the same military literature Napoleon had consumed. They understood the principles of concentration, of supply, of positional advantage. What they did not understand was that Napoleon was not playing the same game. They were playing the game where you move deliberately. Protect your supply lines. Seek favorable ground. And fight when conditions are optimal. Napoleon was playing a different game. A game where speed itself was the weapon. Where the goal was not to find the perfect moment to fight, but to create so much movement, so many simultaneous threats, that the enemy's decision-making process could not keep up. The geometry was not complicated. The execution required a quality that cannot be taught. It required the willingness to move before you were certain, to act on incomplete information, on probability rather than certainty, at a speed that felt reckless from the outside, but was precisely calculated from the inside. By the end of the Italian campaign in 1797, he had won 14 pitched battles and numerous smaller engagements. He had knocked Austria out of northern Italy. He had effectively dictated the terms of the peace treaty, not just as a general but as a political negotiator, exceeding his authority from Paris in ways that the Directory chose to accept because the results were too good to argue with. He was 27 years old. He was also now something the Directory had not anticipated and was not certain how to handle. He was famous, not famous the way generals were famous the way symbols become famous. Napoleon had set up his own printing press in Italy and was producing his own bulletins about his own victories. He understood something that very few military commanders had ever grasped with the same clarity. Winning battles was necessary. It was not sufficient. What mattered beyond the battles was the story of the battles. Who controlled the narrative determined how the victory translated into political power. He was not just fighting the Austrians. He was fighting for the version of himself that would outlast the campaign. The Directory sent him to Egypt in 1798. The official purpose was to threaten British trade routes. The real purpose was to put Napoleon somewhere far away and see whether the distance would diminish him. Egypt did not diminish him. He won the Battle of the Pyramids. He brought scientists and scholars with him to study Egyptian antiquities, a move that revealed something essential about how he understood his own role in history. He was not just a soldier. He was a civilizational force. He thought about what would remain after the fighting. Then the British destroyed his fleet at the Battle of the Nile and stranded him in Egypt with no way home. He left anyway. News had reached him that the Directory was collapsing, that France was in crisis again, that the moment he had been preparing for, perhaps without fully knowing it, was arriving. He did not hesitate. He had spent 20 years being formed by a revolution that rewarded exactly that quality. Now he was going to use it to end the revolution. Not because he wanted to betray it, because he had concluded, with the same cold precision he applied to everything else, that the revolution as it existed could not survive, and that he was the only person who could save what was worth saving. Whether that conclusion was correct is one question. Whether any single person should ever be trusted with that decision is the question underneath it. That question was about to get its answer. Chapter 4. The Saviour, Paris, November 11th, 1799. 2 days after the coup, Napoleon Bonaparte was now First Consul of the French Republic. The title was borrowed from ancient Rome, deliberately, in the way that Napoleon borrowed everything, with full awareness of what the reference was supposed to communicate. Rome, order, civilization, the idea that one man, given sufficient authority, could hold a fractured world together. The politicians who had organized the coup had expected to control that center themselves. Napoleon would be a figurehead, a military symbol to give the whole thing legitimacy, while the real politicians handled the details. They were wrong in the specific way that very intelligent men are wrong, when they underestimate someone they have already decided is manageable. Napoleon was not an intellectual in the way they meant the word. He did not write philosophical treatises. He did not argue about first principles in drawing rooms. He was something more difficult to control than an intellectual. He was a man who read situations the way other men read books, who understood, with an almost physical intuition, what a room wanted, what a country needed, what a moment required, and what France needed in November 1799 was not another constitutional theory. It needed someone to make things work. The first priority was the wars. France had been at war with virtually all of Europe for 7 years. The armies were still fighting. The treasury was still hemorrhaging. Napoleon crossed the Alps in the spring of 1800 with an army and defeated the Austrians at the Battle of Marengo in June. Austria signed peace in February 1801. Britain, exhausted by its own financial strain, signed the Peace of Amiens in March 1802. For the first time in a decade, France was not at war. The silence that followed was something the French people had almost forgotten was possible. An old woman in Paris, according to one account from the period, walked out into the street the morning after the peace was announced, looked up at the sky, and simply stood there for a long time without speaking. She was not dramatic about it. She was not celebrating. She was doing what people do when something they had stopped believing was possible turns out to be real. She was adjusting, France was adjusting, and, into that adjustment, Napoleon placed what would become the most consequential work of his life, the Civil Code. Before the Revolution, France did not have a unified legal system. It had hundreds of them: regional customs, feudal traditions, Roman law in the south, and customary law in the north. A legal landscape so fragmented that the same act could be legal in one province and criminal in the next. The Revolution had announced the principle of equality before the law, but had never actually built the system that would make that principle real in the daily lives of real people. Napoleon built it. He chaired the drafting committee personally, attending the majority of sessions himself and pushing the work forward with a speed that legal scholars found startling. The Civil Code of 1804 guaranteed equality before the law. It protected property rights. It established that guilt had to be proven rather than assumed. It abolished feudal privileges. It made civil marriage the legal standard, removing the Church's monopoly on the recognition of families. These were revolutionary principles, not Napoleon's invention. What he did was turn them into functioning law. There is a difference between announcing that all men are equal before the law and actually building the courts, the procedures, the trained judges, the written statutes that make that equality real. The Revolution had been brilliant at the announcement. It had never found the time or the stability to do the construction. The Revolution announced. Napoleon built. The code spread. As French armies moved across Europe, the code moved with them. It replaced feudal legal systems in territories that had not changed their fundamental legal structure in centuries. Parts of the Civil Code remain in force today. In France, in Belgium, in Quebec, in Louisiana, in dozens of legal systems across the world that were shaped by French influence in the 19th century. Now the Bank of France, established in 1800, before Napoleon, France had been trapped in recurring currency crises that had destabilized every government since 1789. Paper money had collapsed. Wages had become meaningless. Ordinary transactions required bartering because nobody trusted the medium of exchange. The Bank of France created the stable financial infrastructure that made sustained economic activity possible. A merchant in Lyon could now plan 6 months ahead. A farmer in Burgundy could now take out a loan with some reasonable expectation of what the terms would mean when it came time to repay. Small things, daily things, the kind of things that do not make it into histories, but that constitute the actual texture of a life. The prefect system reorganized territorial administration. Napoleon replaced the chaotic local governance of the revolutionary years with a uniform system of appointed administrators, one for each department, directly accountable to the central government. Roads were maintained. Taxes were collected. Local disputes had a functioning address. The national secondary schools, established in 1802, created a standardized educational system open to students on the basis of examination rather than birth. A merchant's son from a provincial town could now compete for the same educational opportunities as the son of a Parisian notable. The Concordat of 1801 settled the long and destructive conflict between the French state and the Catholic Church. Napoleon did not restore the Church's old power. He recognized its social function and gave it back its role in French life while keeping it subordinate to the state. It was a compromise that satisfied neither side completely and functioned better than any of the alternatives that had been tried. What all of these things have in common is this: they were not gestures. They were not announcements. They were structures, built things, things that would continue to exist and to function after Napoleon stopped personally attending to them. This is what the word savior actually means in the context of this story. Not a man who rides in and declares everything better. A man who looks at a decade of chaos and identifies with systematic patience every structural gap that is making normal life impossible, and then fills those gaps, un by un, with the same precision he had applied to military problems for 20 years. The French people felt it in their daily lives almost immediately. Life became more predictable, more stable, more navigable. The currency held its value. The legal system worked. The roads were maintained. The wars, for a few years, stopped. The church was there for the ceremonies that mark a human life. The schools were there for the children. After 10 years of permanent crisis, France had a sense of settled direction. Napoleon provided that, not only through competence, through something that competence alone cannot fully explain, the quality of making the people around him feel that the situation had been understood and that someone knew what came next. In a country that had not had that feeling for a decade, it was powerful. Now here is where the story becomes uncomfortable, because alongside the code and the bank and the schools and the roads, Napoleon built something else. A police state. The Ministry of Police operated with a thoroughness that the old monarchy would have recognized. Networks of informers, surveillance of political dissidents, censorship of newspapers. By 1810, the great majority of French newspapers had been shut down. The remaining publications were under direct government supervision. The revolutionary ideal of a free press was gone. Political opposition was not tolerated. The legislative bodies that nominally existed had real power in theory and almost none in practice. The freedom that the revolution had promised was present in the law. It was absent in the politics. These two things, the functioning civil code and the functioning police state, were not contradictions. They were the same system. Designed with the same logic, Napoleon was building an order in which people were equal in their legal rights and unequal in their political power, where the law protected them from each other, but not from him, where they could own property, form contracts, practice their religion, and educate their children, but could not meaningfully challenge the decisions of the man at the center. That is not a republic, in the sense that 1789 had intended. It is something more stable than a republic and more dangerous, and France, in 1799 and 1800 and 1801, accepted it, not because it was deceived, because it was tired, and because the man offering the arrangement had already proven, in ways that were visible and felt in ordinary life, that he could actually deliver what he promised. That is what made the moment so difficult. He was right about what France needed. And being right, at exactly that moment, meant France would give him everything else he wanted as well. Chapter 5. The Emperor, Notre Dame Cathedral, Paris, December 2nd, 1804. The Pope was there. Pius VII had travelled from Rome to Paris, the first Pope to leave Italy in nearly 300 years, to preside over the coronation of the new Emperor of the French. The papacy had come to Napoleon, not the other way around. And then, at the moment, the ceremony required the Pope to place the crown on Napoleon's head. Napoleon took it from him. He placed it on his own head himself. The gesture had been choreographed in advance. The painter Jacques-Louis David was there to record it for history. Napoleon had thought carefully about what the image would communicate. It would not communicate that his power came from God. Mediated through the Pope, In the traditional model of European monarchy, it would communicate that his power came from himself, from his own capacity, from the will of the French people as expressed through the processes that had ratified his elevation, or, so the image claimed. Beethoven had composed his Third Symphony with a dedication to Napoleon on the title page. When Beethoven heard that Napoleon had declared himself emperor, he crossed out the dedication so violently that he tore the paper. He is nothing but an ordinary man. Now he will trample on all human rights and indulge only his ambition. That reaction captures something real. The sense of betrayal felt by people across Europe who had believed Napoleon represented a new kind of power. Power justified by achievement rather than by birth and tradition. But Beethoven's reaction also contains an assumption worth examining carefully. The assumption that a cleaner alternative existed. By December 1804, Napoleon had been first consul for 5 years. He had made peace with Austria and Britain. He had produced the Civil Code and the Bank of France, and the national school system and the administrative reforms. He had settled the conflict with the Church. He had also survived multiple assassination attempts, royalist conspiracies, Republican conspiracies, British-funded plots to remove him by any available means. And the wars were coming back. Britain had ended the peace in 1803. A new coalition of European powers was forming against France. The diplomatic signals were clear. The monarchies of Europe were not going to accept a French republic indefinitely. The revolutionary settlement was going to have to defend itself again. Napoleon looked at this situation and made a calculation. A republic with a powerful first consul at its center was inherently vulnerable to the argument that it was temporary, that its leader could be replaced, that the right conspiracy or the right military defeat could unwind everything and return France to the chaos of the 1790s. A dynasty was different. A dynasty said that what had been built would continue, that the system was not dependent on the survival of one man, because the institution itself carried the legitimacy forward. Napoleon wanted the empire for the stability of everything he had built. That is his argument, in its most generous form. Now state it less generously. Napoleon wanted the empire because Napoleon wanted the empire. Because the internal logic of his ambition, the same drive that had taken a 9-year-old outsider from Corsica and turned him into the most powerful man in Europe, did not have a natural stopping point. Both of these things were true at the same time, and here is where this chapter must hold something that is genuinely difficult to hold. The temptation is to choose one explanation and dismiss the other, to say he was a cynical opportunist who used the language of stability to justify personal ambition, or to say he was a rational statesman who made a hard but necessary choice for France. The honest position is that Napoleon himself probably could not have separated the two motivations cleanly. The man who was certain he was acting for France and the man who was acting for Napoleon had become, somewhere in the years between Toulon and the coronation, the same man. That fusion is what makes him genuinely difficult to judge. Not the ambition alone, not the idealism alone, the two together, each legitimizing the other, indistinguishable in his own mind. And so the deeper question is not whether Napoleon betrayed the revolution. The deeper question is whether the revolution had already made some form of this outcome close to inevitable. A revolution powerful enough to destroy the old order had proven, across 10 years of attempting, unable to construct a stable new one on its own. Every government that had tried to hold France together through principle alone had failed. The Terror, the Directory, both had tried different approaches. Both had collapsed. The question was no longer whether someone would have to compromise the revolution's ideals to preserve its achievements. The question was, who would do it? And at what cost? Now look at what the empire produced. The legislative bodies that nominally existed were reduced to instruments of ratification. The press censorship deepened. The police surveillance expanded. The nobility came back. Not the old nobility with its feudal privileges. A new nobility. Marshals and ministers and officials given titles by Napoleon's decree. Their elevation dependent entirely on his favor, and their continued loyalty to him personally. The revolution had destroyed a system where birth determined position. Napoleon had built a system where position was determined by Napoleon. The outcomes were not identical. Access to advancement was genuinely broader under Napoleon than under the old monarchy. The civil code still guaranteed legal equality, but the direction of travel was visible, and it was not toward the Republic. Now look at the wars. Austerlitz in 1805, where he defeated the combined armies of Austria and Russia in a battle still studied in military academies today. Jena in 1806, where he destroyed the Prussian army so completely that a military tradition considered the finest in Europe was made to look obsolete in a single afternoon. Wagram in 1809. These victories were real, but here is what the victories meant politically. Each victory extended French power and created new kingdoms ruled by Napoleon's brothers. And each victory required another victory, because the coalitions kept forming, because Britain, protected by its navy, could always find another coalition to fund. Napoleon could win battles. He could not end the wars, because the wars were not ultimately a military problem. They were a political problem that military victories could not permanently resolve. Every nation he defeated produced something he had not fully anticipated, a nationalism that eventually turned against him. Spain is the clearest example. Napoleon placed his brother Joseph on the Spanish throne in 1808. He expected the Spanish to respond the way other populations had responded to French power, with pragmatic acceptance. Spain did not respond that way. The Spanish population rose against the French occupation in a guerrilla war that lasted 6 years and consumed hundreds of thousands of French soldiers. The word guerrilla, meaning little war, entered the European military vocabulary from this conflict. Napoleon had not understood something essential. He could impose French institutions on a population. He could replace their legal system and their government and their ruling dynasty. He could not replace their sense of who they were. The revolution had spread the idea that a people had the right to govern themselves according to their own character and history. Napoleon carried that idea across Europe in his legal codes and his rhetoric, and then he violated it with his armies. He taught Europe that national identity was a source of political legitimacy, and then he gave Europe's nations a common enemy around which to build that identity. It was the deepest contradiction of his empire. The child of a revolution that had announced the rights of peoples built an empire that denied them, and the peoples he had inadvertently taught to think of themselves as peoples would eventually use that lesson to destroy him. In 1807, after his defeat of Russia and Prussia, Napoleon controlled more of Europe than any ruler since Charlemagne. The map was extraordinary. It was also completely dependent on him, not on institutions that could function without him, not on a system of governance built to last beyond one man's continued success, on Napoleon's continued military dominance and his continued physical presence at the center of every decision. The catastrophic mistake came in June 1812. He invaded Russia. The strategic logic that had served him for 20 years turned out not to apply to a country large enough to absorb his army without offering the decisive engagement he needed. The Russians retreated and retreated. and burned their own cities and fields as they went. Napoleon entered Moscow in September. Moscow was empty and burning. He waited for the Tsar to negotiate. The Tsar did not come. He retreated in October, with winter arriving and the Russian army intact behind him. Of the soldiers who crossed into Russia in June, a fraction came back. The coalitions reformed with a coordination and determination that previous coalitions had lacked. At Leipzig, in October 1813, the armies of Russia, Prussia, Austria, and Sweden converged on the French forces and inflicted a defeat that no subsequent victory could reverse. In April 1814, Napoleon abdicated. He was sent to Elba, a small island off the coast of Italy. He escaped in March 1815, landed in southern France, and marched north. The troops sent to arrest him joined him instead. The restored king fled Paris without a shot being fired. Napoleon was emperor again. For 100 days, at Waterloo on June 18th, 1815. The combination of British and Prussian forces ended it permanently. Napoleon abdicated again. This time, they sent him to Saint Helena, an island in the South Atlantic, 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. They had stopped Napoleon from being Napoleon. They had not stopped him from becoming the story of Napoleon. And the story was about to become more consequential than anything that remained of the empire. Chapter 6. The cost. Start with a number. 3,500,000. That is a scholarly estimate of the number of people who died in the Napoleonic Wars between 1803 and 1815. Some historians place the figure considerably higher. The uncertainty exists because the record-keeping of the era was not designed to count the dead with precision, and because the dead included not just soldiers killed in battle, but civilians who died of famine and disease and displacement as armies moved through their towns and consumed their food and burned their crops. 3,500,000 is a floor, not a ceiling. Let that number sit for a moment before moving past it, because the temptation, when telling the story of Napoleon, is to move past the numbers quickly, to acknowledge them in a sentence and then return to the drama of the battles and the brilliance of the tactics and the extraordinary scope of what one man achieved. That temptation is itself part of the problem. The Napoleonic Wars were not the backdrop against which Napoleon's genius operated. They were the cost of it. Every battle that demonstrated his tactical precision represented thousands of men who did not go home. Every campaign that extended French power across Europe represented towns occupied, crops seized, populations conscripted, families destroyed. Napoleon experienced his wars as problems of geometry and logistics. He was genuinely affected by the sight of his own dead on the battlefield. Multiple accounts confirm this. He did not walk through the aftermath of his victories with indifference, but he walked through them anyway. And then he planned the next campaign. The men who fought his wars experienced them differently. A French conscript in the Russian campaign of 1812 did not experience the retreat from Moscow as a strategic reversal in a larger geopolitical contest. He experienced it as weeks of walking through snow with inadequate boots, watching the men around him die of cold and starvation, carrying a musket that was useless because the powder was wet and the fingers that held it were frostbitten. He experienced it as a question he could not answer. What was this for? The Spanish guerrilla war produced atrocities on both sides that the painter Francisco Goya recorded in his series of prints called The Disasters of War. Goya was Spanish. He watched what the French occupation did to his country. He also watched what the Spanish resistance did to French soldiers and to Spanish civilians accused of collaboration. He did not make the prints to celebrate either side. He made them to record what war actually looks like when it is not being described by the people who ordered it. Bodies, executions, civilians, soldiers. The distinction between them collapsed into a shared category of the damaged and the dead. Napoleon would not have understood those images as an indictment. He would have understood them as the inevitable cost of necessary action. That gap in understanding is not a character flaw in the conventional sense. It is what happens when one man's vision of historical necessity becomes the operating principle of an entire civilization. The people inside the vision do not get to evaluate the vision. They only experience the cost of it. Now look at a cost that receives less attention than the battlefield casualties. The continental system. Napoleon's strategy for defeating Britain without being able to cross the Channel was economic. Close European ports to British trade. Strangle the British economy. Force Britain to the negotiating table through commercial pressure rather than military force. The theory was not unreasonable. The execution was a catastrophe for everyone except Britain. The system required the cooperation of every European power within Napoleon's orbit. Portugal refused. Russia agreed at the negotiations after Tilsit and then quietly reopened its ports to British goods because the Russian economy could not sustain the closure. The system that was supposed to strangle Britain strangled European commerce instead. Unemployment rose in French manufacturing cities. Consumer goods became scarce. The populations that Napoleon's legal reforms had given equality before the law were now experiencing the equality of shared economic deprivation. Enforcing the system required more military pressure, which required more wars, which required more conscription, which required more dead. The cost of the continental system was paid not by Britain, but by the people Napoleon was governing for their benefit. Now look at what it cost France specifically. Between 1800 and 1815, France lost an enormous portion of a generation of young men to military service. The demographic consequences lasted for decades. France entered the Napoleonic period as one of the most populous nations in Europe. It exited with a population structure permanently altered by the loss of young men in their prime years. The economic consequences were equally severe. The wars had been financed partly through the systematic extraction of resources from occupied territories, a system that worked when France was winning and collapsed when France stopped winning. The political consequences were the deepest. The revolution had announced that the French people were sovereign. That power flowed upward from the governed to the governors. Napoleon had preserved that principle in form while hollowing it out in practice. By 1814, France had a population that had been told it was sovereign for 25 years and had spent most of those years with no meaningful influence over the decisions that determined whether its sons lived or died. The plebiscites that had ratified Napoleon's elevation were not free exercises of popular will. They were managed performances of consent in which the outcome was determined before the voting began. The legislature that nominally represented the French people had been reduced to a body whose function was to approve decisions already made. The press that should have informed French citizens about their government had been systematically eliminated or controlled. France had the vocabulary of popular sovereignty and the reality of one-man rule. And the one man had taken the country into a war with Russia that killed hundreds of thousands of French soldiers for reasons that the French people had never been asked to evaluate. This is the cost that does not appear in the casualty statistics. The cost to the idea that the revolution had been building, the idea that governance requires the genuine consent of the governed. That power must be accountable to the people it is exercised over. That no single man's judgment, however capable, is a sufficient substitute for the collective judgment of a free people working through legitimate institutions. Napoleon had not destroyed that idea. It was too deeply embedded in the civil code, in the institutional memory of the revolutionary period, in the minds of people who had lived through 1789, to be destroyed by one man's ambition. But he had demonstrated something about it that was deeply unsettling. He had demonstrated that the idea was vulnerable, that a population exhausted by crisis would trade the practice of that idea for the comfort of a man who seemed to know what he was doing. That was a lesson that people who wanted power and were willing to offer comfort would not forget. Now come to a moment that broke through the surface of Napoleon's controlled public image. Vienna, October 13, 1809. A young man named Friedrich Staps approached Napoleon with a kitchen knife concealed in his coat. Staps was 17 years old, the son of a German Lutheran pastor. He had traveled alone to find Napoleon and kill him. The attempt failed. Staps was arrested, interrogated by Napoleon personally, and executed. What Napoleon could not understand in that interrogation was the young man's motivation. Staps was not a royalist. He was not acting for any government or political faction. He had not been paid or organized or directed by anyone. He simply believed that Napoleon was destroying Germany, that the imposition of French authority over territories that had their own histories and their own identities was an act of violence against something real and worth protecting. Napoleon asked him if he felt remorse. Staps said that his only regret was that he had failed. Napoleon was genuinely disturbed by this. Not frightened, disturbed, because Staps represented something that Napoleon's entire framework for understanding power could not fully account for. A person who was not acting from interest. Napoleon understood interest. He understood ambition and fear and loyalty, purchased by reward and opposition, motivated by rivalry. He understood the calculations that drove coalitions and the pressures that made governments make decisions. He did not fully understand the person who acted from pure conviction, uncomplicated by self-interest. That kind of motivation was the same energy that had driven the revolution in 1789. Napoleon had learned to manage it and redirect it. He had never fully understood it, and it was multiplying across Europe, in Spain, in Germany, in Russia, in every territory where French power had arrived, with legal reforms in one hand and conscription orders in the other. Populations were developing a relationship to their own national identity that made them resistant to French authority in ways that military force could suppress but not eliminate. Napoleon had spread revolutionary nationalism across Europe, and revolutionary nationalism was now being used against him. Here is the deepest cost. The French Revolution had been, at its heart, an experiment in the possibility of human self-governance. The idea that people could organize their collective life according to principles they had chosen rather than traditions they had inherited. That experiment required, to survive, the development of institutions and habits and political practices that could sustain self-governance through crises without collapsing into the demand for a commanding figure. The revolution had not had time to develop those things before the crises arrived. Napoleon had stepped into that gap, and by stepping into it, he had prevented the development of the very capacities that would have made his stepping in unnecessary. Every year that France was governed by Napoleon's judgment, rather than its own accountable institutions, was a year in which French political culture did not develop the capacity for self-governance that the revolution had promised. Every crisis that Napoleon resolved by personal decision was a crisis that did not produce the institutional learning that comes from working through hard problems within a system that can be held responsible. He solved France's problems so effectively that France did not learn to solve its own problems. And when he was gone, the problems came back. France went through 5 different political systems between 1815 and 1870. Restored monarchy, constitutional monarchy, republic, empire again. Under his nephew, republic again. The instability Napoleon had suppressed did not disappear when he disappeared. It had simply been waiting. The civil code lasted. The Bank of France lasted. The administrative structures lasted. The legal equality lasted. The political culture that could sustain those achievements without a commanding figure at the center did not last, because it had never been allowed to develop. That is not a simple judgment of Napoleon as a person. It is a description of the trap that the situation created, that he walked into, and that France paid for across the entire 19th century. The trap was this. France needed order badly enough to accept Napoleon. Napoleon provided order so completely that France never had to build the capacity to provide it for itself. The thing that saved France in the short term made it more vulnerable in the long term. Power, that total, held that long by one man, does not produce the insight that the power should be limited. It produces the certainty that it should not be. And France, and Europe, and the world paid for that certainty in numbers that begin at 3,500,000 and do not have a clean upper bound. The cost was real. The cost was enormous. And the cost was inseparable from the achievement. You could not have the civil code without the wars that spread it. You could not have the administrative state without the authoritarian who built it. You could not have the legal equality without the emperor who embedded it in law, while eliminating the political accountability that would have held him responsible for everything else. The achievement and the cost were not 2 separate things that happened to occur alongside each other. They were the same thing, seen from different angles, paid for by different people. The generals who won at Austerlitz and the conscripts who froze to death outside Moscow were both inside the same story. The story of a man who preserved what could be preserved and destroyed what could not be controlled, and called the whole thing necessary. He was not wrong about the necessity. He was also not the one who paid for it. Saint Helena, 1821. The island was 50 miles of volcanic rock in the middle of the South Atlantic, 2,000 miles from the nearest continent. The British had chosen it with care, not as punishment, though it functioned as punishment, as certainty. There was no escape from Saint Helena because there was nowhere to escape to. Napoleon arrived in October 1815. He was 46 years old. He would not leave. The man who had moved armies across a continent with a speed that Europe could not comprehend was now confined to a damp house on a windy island, arguing with his British jailer about the size of his riding area and the number of servants he was permitted. The physical confinement was real. The mental confinement was not, because Napoleon understood something on Saint Helena that he had perhaps always understood but had never had the stillness to fully develop. The battlefield was over. The political battlefield was over. But there was a third battlefield, one that had no geographical boundary and no time limit, the battlefield of memory. He began to talk to his companions, to his secretaries, to anyone who would record what he said. He talked about his life, his decisions, his intention, his legacy. The memoirs dictated on Saint Helena run to thousands of pages. They are not honest documents in the conventional sense. They are a sustained act of self-construction, a deliberate attempt to shape how the world would understand him after he was gone. He rewrote his relationship to the revolution. He had always been its servant. He said, Its defender, the man who had taken the chaos of the revolutionary years and given its principles durable form. The empire had been a necessity forced on him by the monarchies of Europe. The wars had been defensive. The expansion had been reluctant. None of this was entirely true. None of it was entirely false. That was the genius of it. He understood that the most durable version of a story is not the most accurate one. It is the one that contains enough truth to be believable and enough simplification to be remembered. History is not simply what happened. History is the version of what happened that survives. And he intended to be the author of his own survival. He died on May 5th, 1821. He was 51 years old. His last recorded words included the name Josephine. His first wife, whom he had divorced because she could not give him an heir, and whom he had never stopped caring for, in the complicated way that Napoleon cared for anything that was not a military problem. He also said France, army, not empire, not glory, not the code or the administrative reforms or the institutional achievements that had been the most durable part of his work. France, army, the man who had spent 20 years constructing the most deliberate public persona in modern history, died, reaching for the things that had been real before the construction began. A country he had adopted because he had nowhere else to go. The soldiers he had led and spent and mourned. The performance was over. What remained was what had always been underneath it. Now, step back from the island, step back from the man, and look at what he left. The civil code was still operating in France, in Belgium, in Quebec, in Louisiana, in dozens of legal systems shaped by French influence across the 19th century. The principle that every citizen stood equal before the law, regardless of birth, regardless of wealth, regardless of religion, was functioning law in more places than it had been before Napoleon took power. The administrative model he had built was still running. Other countries had studied it and adapted elements of it. The idea of the modern centralized state, capable of delivering services and enforcing laws and collecting taxes with uniform efficiency across its entire territory, owed more to Napoleon than to almost any other single figure of his era. The legal equality he had written into the code had spread to territories that French armies had occupied and then left. The feudal systems those armies had dismantled did not fully reassemble themselves after the French departed. The populations that had experienced legal equality, however, imperfectly, proved resistant to the complete restoration of the old arrangements. The revolution's ideas had travelled on Napoleon's bayonets. That is an uncomfortable sentence. It is also accurate. And now come to the question that the title of this story announced, and that the story itself has been building toward. Did Napoleon save the French Revolution by ending it? Here is the honest answer. He saved what could be governed, the principles that could be written into law: equality before courts, protection of property, careers open to talent, the secular state, the rationalized administration. These Napoleon took from the revolutionary chaos and embedded in institutions durable enough to outlast him. What he ended was something different. He ended the possibility that the revolution could continue as a living experiment, as an open question about what self-governance could become, if given enough time and enough stability to develop its own answers. The revolution had been, at its best, a society trying to figure out how free people organize themselves, messily, violently, with terrible detours through the terror and the Directory, but genuinely trying. Napoleon closed that experiment, not because he was a tyrant in the simple sense, but because the experiment required uncertainty, required the willingness to not know the answer yet, required the political space for genuine disagreement and genuine accountability. And Napoleon, by his nature and by the nature of the power he accumulated, could not permit that uncertainty. He knew what France needed. He was largely right about what France needed. And being right, and being the only person in a position to provide it, meant that France never had to develop its own answer. That is the loss that the Civil Code and the Bank of France and the administrative system cannot compensate for. The Revolution had promised France not just good laws but self-governance. Not just equality before the law, but the capacity to hold power accountable. Napoleon preserved the first promise. He made the second one impossible to keep while he was alive. And the habits of self-governance, the institutional practices, the political culture that learns to resolve its own conflicts without reaching for a commanding figure. Those things require time and practice and the experience of working through crises within accountable systems. France did not get that time. Europe did not get that time because Napoleon was there, solving the problems, making the decisions, being right often enough that the alternative seemed unthinkable. He proved something that revolutions have been proving ever since. A revolution can topple a king with ideas. It cannot govern with ideas alone. At some point, the ideas have to become institutions, and institutions require people willing to work within them, even when the outcomes are slow and imperfect and deeply unsatisfying. That willingness is hard to maintain in a crisis, and revolutions are always in a crisis, which means they are always vulnerable to the man who arrives and says he knows what to do. Sometimes that man is right. Napoleon was largely right, and even being largely right extracted a cost that the people who paid it did not choose and were not asked about. Here is the question underneath the question. The French Revolution asked whether free people could govern themselves. Napoleon answered that question by governing them so effectively that they did not have to. And in every political moment since, in every society that has found itself exhausted enough to consider trading accountability for competence, the same structure returns. Not the same man. The same moment. The moment when the answer to a crisis arrives in a form that requires giving up something essential about what the crisis was supposed to be about. Napoleon did not simply save the revolution or betray it. He preserved what could govern, and destroyed what could not be controlled. And the most unsettling thing about that sentence is not what it says about Napoleon. It is what it says about the distance between the principles we announce in our best moments and the arrangements we accept in our most exhausted ones. Napoleon became necessary. At the exact moment, necessity became dangerous. That moment has happened before him. It has happened after him. And it has not finished happening. The month of August sits in your calendar because Julius Caesar put it there and Augustus kept it. But the pattern that Napoleon refined, the pattern of the indispensable man who arrives to save a system and becomes the reason the system cannot save itself, that pattern runs through political history in ways that do not carry his name. He was 46 when he arrived on Saint Helena. He was 51 when he died there. Still dictating, still constructing, still fighting the only battle he had left. He had played his part well. The part just required more of the world than the world had agreed to give, and less of the freedom the revolution had promised than any of them, including Napoleon, had ever fully admitted.